exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
Right, we are here with Benjamin Balderson, the Odins Alchemist. Benjamin, do you prefer Ben or Benjamin?
Ben's just fine, but yeah, most people call me Benjamin. I guess
Awesome.
that just started a few years ago. I don't know why, but yeah.
The Benjamin thing or the Ben thing?
Yeah, the Benjamin thing. You know, when I was young, everybody just called me Ben, but probably like 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that, everybody switched to Benjamin.
That's cool. So,
You
all
bet.
right, out the gate. So you give this really cool description of like humanity and our energetic systems and how it all aligns with like the understanding of like a world battery relative to like a galvanic battery or photovoltaics, and how they can kind of correspond with the luminaries and Earth, like as that salt bridge between the solar and lunar, the anode or cathode. And then, you know, as within us and our, what is it? The cerebrum and the cerebellum representing the anode and cathode, or the sun in our bodies. So could you kind of walk through like this concept in like some more detail? Because I think it really puts like a lot into a really comprehensive perspective as far as like the alchemical kind of terminology can play into like so many various aspects.
Absolutely. So about a couple of years ago, a fellow named L.C. King contacted me, and he was looking at the world as a battery in an enclosed system. And some of the things he was digging up and presenting were really, really interesting. But he wanted to bring me in to bring in an alchemist perspective and all the different mythology and theology things that I understand and know, and the way I change things from that into actual reality, so we could start looking at some of the myths to try and further this idea and get a true understanding of what is going on with our world. And so over the last couple of years, we've been developing and working on this idea and looking at the actual world and how it functions. And one of the first things to understand is I use alchemy for just about everything. That's all alchemy is, in its most basic sense, is taking things in nature and breaking them down to their most base fine components, and then putting them back together and understanding the relationships and the interactions that these things have with each other. So when you're using that as your mechanical filter, then you get to truly just understand what's working, what's happening, because that's all alchemy is that was the basis for science. So what you need to understand then is a galvanic battery, which a galvanic battery is, you've got an anode and a cathode. The cathode's your plus and the anode is your minus. So in between connecting these two things then is a wire or a bridge. And then the two things are floating in an electrolytic solution, which just means that there's a liquid in there that's got, typically it's going to have some type of either acid or base. Either way, it's going to be caustic or acidic. So that way it's able to break down the metals slightly. And that's part of what's going to be releasing these charges when you're talking about galvanic, because when we're in the galvanic process, what that is a biochemical electrical reaction. So the anode, which is the negative, always needs to be, as far as a galvanic cell anyways, slightly less stable than the cathode. And so that way that can break apart and degrade. And as that's happening, what's going to happen is the anode, one of the particles or a couple particles are actually going to split. So you've got, in this case, as the moon, silver, a silver particle is going to split. And in that, the negative side is going to go and race right through that wire and jump itself directly over to the cathode, because this is the negative side's the masculine side. And as we understand, men take direct paths. This is why when you're looking at sacred geometry, the straight lines are masculine and then the curvy, swoopy lines are feminine, because the masculine side is going to take that direct path as much as possible. So this negative masculine side is going to jump straight down and rush right over to the anode. Then the feminine side, which is what, and I'm going to use their terminology because it just gets confusing. But once you start getting into some of these things, you understand most of these things have been misdescribed. So the negative side is going to be called an electron. Now, then the positive side of this particle is going to be called an ion. And Steve, can you go deal with alpacas? That's called an ion. And yeah, I could see these alpacas getting ornery right out the window right here and just acting fools.
Alpaca probs.
Horrible. Yeah, the farm. Yeah, all this time I've been doing interviews from the road. Everybody doesn't realize the nonsense that happens in my home. Poor Steve, his people don't even know about that, and he's got goats rushing in behind him and stuff. Like, what's going on over here? Like, so the positive side, or the ion, is gonna then float in that electrolytic solution, and it's just gonna kind of float along. And now what's going to draw it is that these electrons have went over and went to the cathode, which changes the charge of the cathode, giving it a more negative charge. And now that creates that imbalance. So the positive wants to float over and move over to that negative charge and meet it. Now, in this electrolytic solution, there's two different processes that are happening. On one side of it is the oxidation, which is where that particle is breaking apart. And when that particle breaks apart, we need that oxygen in order to take the positive half of that and float that away. And the oxygen is going to do the same thing you're going to see inside of your body, inside of all over in the world, where oxygen inside your body is going in, and as your body is breaking down the different foods and things, you've got to get that carbon out of there in order for you to get access to the minerals in the oil, because that carbon's stopping it. And so you start oxidating out that carbon and then breathing it out and getting it out of your system. And that's what your oxygen's doing. Well, now inside this battery, it's doing the exact same thing. It's pulling, as that particle breaks up, it's pulling that stuff and exiting it out. Well, now as it's drawn over to the cathode side, or the positive side, this is a different type of reaction. Now in the cathode side, these two particles are going to try to come back together. And so this is going to be a fusion type reaction rather than a fission type reaction, where now instead of a particle breaking apart, a particles getting incorporated into the system. And that's a fusion type thing. And that's going to be driven through hydrogen. And the hydrogen is going to open up that pathway and allow that to drive in there. So when we're looking at the battery and alchemically, the way these components are working, then the cathode is going to be your sulfur side. That's going to be your positive. And your salt is going to be your negative, and then the mercurial solution is what all the energy transfers through. That's what's making this entire energetic transfer possible, is this mercurial solution. So, and then furthermore, the mercurial solution has both a positive and negative aspect, even while the battery's operating, where the negative side, while it's operating, is always negative. The positive side's always positive. that mercurial solution, in one instance, it was breaking apart and it was taking. And then in the other instance, it was giving and incorporating, two exact opposite actions. So this is part of where you're starting to see where Mercury starts getting that hermaphroditic, where it's not really one side or the other. It's kind of a confused type symbology. That's because Mercury does multiple actions where the other two pieces are only doing a singular action.
Wow.
So when you so when you take and you start applying this to the world, then is the planetary metals. And what we need to understand when we look at planets, these are just your wandering stars, as opposed to your fixed stars, which were in a system that's enclosed, that's separating us from other things. And inside of this enclosure, we have wandering stars that are not following the order of any of the other stars. Well, these wandering stars each have then an association to metal. So with the moon, as I just said, it's silver. With the sun, it's gold. And then we have iron with Mars. We have copper with Venus, tin with Jupiter, lead with Saturn, aluminum or uranium. I'm working on that one. So classically, it's aluminum for Uranus, the original Sky Father. But I think that's kind of a misunderstanding, and I think it's actually uranium.
What are your thoughts?
Sorry,
go ahead.
As I'm looking at that and studying it, like you go and look at a nuclear reactor, a uranium reactor, they call them a uranium aluminum reactor. It's not just uranium; it's always a uranium aluminum, which is very interesting. Then
that is interesting.
I think that these two are tied. Yeah.
Well,
Yep.
What are your thoughts on the correlations between Pluto and plutonium? Or
See,
do
and
you have
again, same idea, because then I think then on this other end, we're getting more on the radioactive type metals, because you've got multiple different energies. Even with a battery or a magnet, the same thing. There's a more subtle side to the energies, like gold. Most people realize gold is not magnetic, but it's actually slightly anti-magnetic, which isn't a super strong force. But then if you pass gold over the magnet, it'll actually repel just ever so slightly, and push just ever so slightly away from it. It's a really interesting thing to watch. And we're going to have the same kind of interactions in the sky. It's going to split into a cerebrum and a cerebellum. So some of them are going to produce one type of energy, and some of them are going to more produce on the negative side of energy.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Yeah, I like how I think you described like the pineal gland is kind of like that mercurial charge transfer medium between the cerebellum and the cerebrum.
And the cerebrum.
That's really interesting and fascinating. To think if we were to learn about the archetypal, like mercurial principle in school, if we had the knowledge of this, like imagine the innovations that would be taking place in society. It would be absolutely insane.
Oh yeah. You wouldn't start out being just a complete retard when you're 20, walking out in the world just blind. You'd actually have a real base set of things. So back to what we were just talking about. So then when we look at if we take and we associate plutonium to Pluto and uranium to Uranus, the energy that they're giving out is through decay. That's through a decay, which is more of an anodic type of thing, where on the anode side, things are decaying, it's breaking apart. And then on the cathode side, it's actually coming together, and it's a fusion reaction, not a fission type reaction or a decay type reaction. It's actually fusing and growing. And that's on the more noble side of things. So when you're splitting then the planets, again, things are going to become more masculine on the anodic side, and you are going to have more decay. So that would make absolute perfect sense that Pluto, Uranus, the ones that are on the more masculine side, would get their energy from a decay type situation.
Wow. So essentially, you need an anode and a cathode to set up the conditions for oscillation and degradation. And oscillation and degradation are essentially universal principles that give the conditions for processes in nature to carry themselves out. Is that how you would describe it, or how would you kind of?
Absolutely. Only add in fusion in there also, because after the particles break down and you get this degradation, the thing that's going to happen as this degradation happens is it's no longer a stable particle. So now it wants to go and bond with something else. So if we take like glucose in your body, most people think that you're operating off glucose, but you're not. Glucose is actually a fairly stable substance. And so the glucose has to be decarbonated, which means that a carbon molecule, which when you're listening to chemistry, when they're talking about how many carbon molecules it takes to bond something, now this carbon molecule needs to be knocked out of there, because in order for that to be a stable substance on its own, it needed that carbon molecule. Now we don't want that in there, and we don't want it to be a stable substance, because we're going to then fuse it into our body. So we're going to make it an unstable substance by knocking this carbon molecule out of it. And now it's able to bond with your system, because it's now unstable and now is going to bond in there and actually fuse and incorporate itself into your system and become part of your system. Just like that silver particle broke off and then fused itself to the other side. And the other side, you can look up a galvanic cell, the cathode truly becomes bigger and heavier as this battery operates. Silver literally wears away and becomes gold. And then you look at the other luminaries, those are going to be the plates in between these things, and they're also going to help things operate. And so depending on where they sit in relation to the other plates or the anode or the cathode, depends on where they're passing energy forward and back, creating this oscillation back and forth. Absolutely, because we have all dissolution. If we had all dissolution, it would turn into a pile of goo, right? We can't have all fusion because we need pieces to fuse in there. So we need this oscillation back and forth to happen.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that. So this decarbonization. Process. So would this be akin to like the calcination process within producing a spagyric, where you would essentially strip it down?
Absolutely.
Okay, interesting. That is fascinating.
In the calcination process, typically then the carbon, again, that carbon creates the bond, right? So what you had was your salt and your sulfur mercury side, but they needed to be bonded together. So actually these two things are fairly stable on their own. So when you're doing this calcination, it's going to actually remove this carbon that was creating this bond between the two sides, and you're actually going to get back down to the epitome of just the crystal. So that way you can now open that back up and marry those two things perfectly together, because that carbon bond was an imperfect bond. That was more like an amalgam. Ha ha. That was more like my wife and I, she's my grammar Nazi. And the worst part is I've read vastly more words than I've ever said. So I mispronounce so damn many things. And then if you bother me about it, I just start mispronouncing it further just to piss people off. Anyways. So it's really more of an amalgam as opposed to like an alloy. An alloy is where you've done this, knocked out some of the pieces of the molecule so they'll bond on a molecular level, as opposed to just mixing together like Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid's just kind of mixed together. You could distill out the Kool-Aid, and this would really easily come apart. After the alchemical process, after you've removed that carbon bond and gotten down to the serious part of it, then when you remarry those two things, you can't separate those things through distillation like that or anything anymore. The whole thing's going to rise up as one and then fall back as one. And it's actually going to exhibit both the masculine and feminine characteristics, because when it falls, it's going to be hard like a stone. But when you throw heat to it, it's going to evaporate like the feminine side or the oil side. So it's going to become right. Sorry.
That's just, but it's very, like, I love the way that you describe it, because you do it from such a unique perspective. So an amalgam essentially would be something you're mixing that contains carbon. An alloy is something that's basically stripped of that carbon in order to create a more pure fusion. Is that correct?
Right. Absolutely. Okay. That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, where that carbon was actually kind of creating ohms. And that's why I always like to bring things to electrical too, that in your carbon body, while you need this in order to make these two things stay together right now, it's also creating ohms at the same time. So carbon in and of itself is mercurial because it's creating this bond, this transfer between your sulfur and your salt, and you need it there. But then the great work is you as an alchemist burning that out and making the pure bond between the salt and the oil and the sulfur, and getting that purity of it and getting that carbon ohmage out of there. That's why they call your earth body dirty, and there's all these crazy that's dirty and it's bad and you were born impure and all this. And they just took the scientifically they're right. Again, that carbon is creating ohms. It's creating a dirty connection, but you need that until you're here and you can do the great work and make that better connection. So it's weird to be take that morally like that.
Absolutely. That is fascinating. Can you elaborate on the notion of ohms, like that you're speaking about in relation to the carbon?
So there's now, again, let's bring this back to then electrical. When you're looking at a conductor, what your typical conductor is going to do is we're going to use, and again, I'm going to use their terminology to keep everybody from getting confused. You're going to have a conductor, and that's going to have a bunch of particles of, say, copper in a tube. Well, this electron is going to go in this side, and it's going to bump these electrons, and the electrons are going to go, and that electron is going to drop out the other side, and now it's going to be usable. But on this path, it was every time it does that, it also kind of bumps in other directions. It hits the other side, so you get energy loss. And that's going to exhibit in radiation. It's going to exhibit in heat. If you have a wire that you're using a lot of energy through, you can grab that bugger and feel it. It's hot. All those things are energy that could have and should have went to the other side, but instead it's now dispersed itself in other directions and in other ways. And you can take one of them fancy little electrical toys. I don't know what they're called. We always called them wiggies when I was an electrician. Everything was a fucking wiggy. Go get me the wiggy. Which wiggy do you want, dude?
That's hilarious.
But you just put it next to a live electrical wire and it would. Well, that was reading the radiation that was being let off of that wire. So all those things are going to be ohmage. So it's not allowing the energy to transfer from one side to the other. It's stopping it somewhere in the middle. Now, in some instances, those ohms are useful. Like you take a toaster, that is specifically because of ohms. That electricity should have easily flowed from one side to the other, but because them particles are making it hard to bump its way through, it's now releasing in heat in an easier manner rather than get to the other side easily. And it's specifically made like that. And then that heat now toasts your toast, and it's very nice.
Interesting.
But
so then sorry, go ahead.
But typically you don't want that ohmage. If you're trying to draw off of that power off the other side, then that becomes horrible. You're like, well, where'd all my power go? So now what then we understand is there's another thing called a superconductor, which is it's a rather hard state to reach. But in that state, these particles are so perfectly aligned with each other and so perfectly in sync and in step that power that gets put on this side exists on this side at the exact same time. There is no transfer between the two things. It's immediate. There's no power loss. There's no anything. So there's also no time loss. For all practical purposes, and as far as we can understand, the instant that thing is on this side of a superconductor, no matter how big that superconductor or how long it is, it could be 1,000 miles away, and this thing will exist over there simultaneously.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I believe that they've created like dual superconductors that work in tandem with each other as well. And has essentially there's no interference or whatever. So, but I wanted to ask you a question about,
ohms.
Your ohmage, is that essentially related to conductivity and how you would determine the conductivity of something? Like, so say if you have
absolutely
gold versus copper, and the conductivity of gold versus the conductivity of gold, would that be due to the ohmage factor?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Absolutely,
okay.
It would.
All right. So
yep. How tight are these molecules? How easily do they pass through each other? How pure is this thing? All these things are going to add every time you add. It gets less and less of the purity of the tightness. You get greater ohmage. These particles have a harder time.
From my perspective, listening to you talk about all this, it seems to me like in order to understand metallic alchemy or just metallic chemistry in general, you have to have an understanding of electrical principles. Otherwise, you're really not getting a full grip on the picture as a whole. But do you feel that same way? Yeah, that's fascinating.
Absolutely.
Okay,
and in fact, I've been told a number of times. I've never been to trained as a shaman or anything like that. And I've never been to too many of them, but I've been told by a number of people that have trained with shamans and, spiritual teachers, things like that, that electricians typically are more spiritual and have more understanding than anybody. And it's because electrically, everything's working electrically. And if you once you start getting a firm grip of the mechanics of that, and you can start seeing that applies everywhere, whether it's just straight electrical or whether it's bioelectrical, it's still all electrical and all works the damn same.
100%. So, okay, sulfation. Can you explain the term sulfation and what that means, like within a battery? Like if a battery starts sulfating, could you describe that?
Yeah, so again, when there's this differential between the salt side and the sulfur side, which the plates then at that point are going to be considered the salt or the sulfur side, and the salt isn't the salt side. Well, these two things are kind of separate. There's got to be a differential. Again, we're just like when we started talking about it, the one side's got to be more degradatory than the other. There's got to be a differential. Now, also as an earth battery, we also have the hot and cold differential. So where it's daytime out, we have a ton of heat, and it's nighttime out, we don't experience that heat. there's the differential there also, and that's creating power. And then also on the sun side, it's acidic, so it's wet, it's hydrogenated. And on the moon side, it's base and it's dry and it's cold. So dry, cold, masculine. So there's a bunch of differentials happening here to make this whole energetic system happen.
Wow.
But when you're talking about sulfation in a battery, as this battery wears and wears, what happens is the lead crystals, say it's a lead acid battery, it doesn't have to be lead crystals, but a lead acid battery, your typical battery that most people think of when they're looking at it, the crystals will actually go bond and sulfate to the plates, and you're going to lose that differential. It's basically like having a direct short now electrically. You aren't really getting that differential anymore, and you're not going to get this energy transfer anymore, and that will build up and build up. So then when you go recharge a rechargeable battery, what's going to happen is you're going to hit it with the charger and throw a hard electrical charge into the system, which is then going to start an electrolysis process, where electrolysis is the opposite of galvanic. Galvanic things were biochemically breaking down and then transferring over and actually reducing into one thing. Electrolysis is splitting the whole system apart through direct use of energy, which would be just the sulfur side. You're just hitting it with just the direct energy and splitting all these different pieces apart. Now, when that happens, these crystals will actually break away and actually break themselves back off. Everything will start breaking apart and sending it back to where it was supposed to be. And for some reason, people understand that with a magnet better than they do with a battery or with electricity. Everybody understands that when a magnet loses its polarity, that now that magnet won't work. It's just a dead piece of iron. It doesn't do anything. It's only through that polarization where I've sent half the negative side to one side, the positive side to the other. And now with that differential, we have power. It's not a dead piece of metal. And the same thing applies electrically. You still have to have that differential. You can have all the positive in the world, but without the ground, without the negative side, it doesn't do anything. It's just going to sit there. You can hold a extraordinarily powerful wire out into the air, just sit there, and it doesn't do anything. It's not till it touches something and rushes to ground that all of a sudden there's something achieved.
Definitely. Yeah, this definitely speaks to the principle of polarity just within nature overall, I think. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, I want to ask you about yourself as an Odinist and kind of what that all means to you. But take a quick break real quick. And then you describe yourself as an Odinist. Could you please elaborate just on a little bit of like the overall Odinist cosmology as you see it?
Absolutely. So basically, I'm a Germanic heathen, and I follow the old ways. My people traditionally would have followed Odin, and we were forced to switch our religions, switch our gods, switch the things that we knew in order to not be tortured to death. So we let go of a lot of the old ways and a lot of the natural truths that we had. And throughout the years, I've studied just about every theology. And I respect them all, and they're all beautiful. And it was wonderful to find that when I did switch to Odinism, which is the following of the Norse Germanic gods, that one of Odin's principles is if you want to be a wise man, you need to go to other people in other cultures and learn from them. So I was actually following these things before I even knew it. But then one day, which I had already pretty much settled onto the left-hand mercurial type path. Anyways, so I started studying Odin as one of the left-hand path mercurial figures. And the primary book for Odinism is going to be the Havamal, and this is just the words of the wise one, the words of Odin. And I read through this, and I was like, I'm already living 95% of this. Like, this is just how I see the world. What is going on here? Who? and so then from that point, and the Havamal doesn't so much flesh out the entire Norse and Germanic cosmology. It's more just the wisdoms to understand. So the one section is your host rights, one section is your guest rights, and then one section is more things about the world and his travels and things that he did in the world to get these understandings, including the runes. So I just found this absolutely beautiful and amazing. And like I said, it was already just how I live. So then I went and further started researching it. And the more I got into the Norse mythology, the more amazed I was. And again, by this point in time, I was an alchemist. So I'm using the alchemical filter to go through all these things, and I'm finding it absolutely amazing. One of the first things that you find is the heathen creation story, which is just stunning. It's the world starts out as Gununga Gap, which is the great yawning chasm. And then that's going to be the feminine side. And then the masculine side is two worlds, Niflheim and Muspelheim. And Niflheim's going to be the masculine side. And Muspelheim is going to be the masculine feminine side. So that one's fiery and chaotic. And the masculine side's cold, dense. It doesn't move. That's the immovable object, as opposed to the unstoppable force. Now, these two things are completely just separate, and there is no life. It's not until there's this interaction between the two, which Gununga Gap creates, and she pulls the two worlds together. And where these two worlds collide, a Vesca Pisces forms, and inside that Vesca, 9 realms appear. And these 9 realms are represented by the different levels of the Vesca Pisces, with the 4 being the center, everything above the, or 5 being the center, everything above the 5, the other 4 realms are more chaotic, more etheric, more sulfur side. Everything underneath the 5, the 5th level, the Midgard, the very center level, is going to then be more salty, more dense, more stable and structured. So once these two things came together, now life appeared. And life appeared in 2 beings. These beings were Ymir, the great frozen giant, and Adumbla, the great cow, the feminine cow. So Adumbla starts licking at the ice of Ymir and frees the masculine side. And this is how things work. What we're seeing is nature taking its course. Adumbla, the feminine side, is unlocking this masculine structured side. And now we have movement. Now we have action. And when we look at that, Adumbla is, with her licking, is the rays of the sun. And the same thing is represented in like Greek. We have Apollo. With Apollo has the all the cattle, and inside their horns is the gold of the sun. We have the horns of Hathor. So this representation is used over and over again across all kinds of different mythologies, where then this feminine side has now unlocked the ice side, and we have then further life becomes expressed as this continues on. And from the fecund areas of Ymir, his armpits, in between his toes, the things like that, dwarves appear, elves appear, other forms of life start appearing and expressing themselves as the masculine and feminine meet.
Wow, man, that's amazing. Yeah. You're doing a fantastic job at preserving the understanding of Odinism, I would say, because you definitely tie in a lot of pieces and information that I don't hear very often discussed. So that's amazing. So there, I don't know, there's someone that I would want you to be familiar with. His name is Phoenix Aurelius. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's an alchemist as well. I feel like you two would probably have a fascinating conversation because he kind of comes from a similar perspective, as well as tying in the alchemical tradition. So
Yeah,
I
Phoenix and I don't really get along.
Oh yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't particularly get along. It's just one
All
of
right.
those things, you know. It's you would think that we would get along, but
Mhm.
you know, maybe we're just two on a similar pole, I guess.
Right.
You know, we don't in particular get along.
Alrighty then. Well,
But
that's
that's
that.
okay. That's okay.
For sure.
Exactly. Just that
So
easy. No
you
harm
have
done.
no harm, no foul. You had this really cool other mythological kind of reference in regard to like the process of decarbylation. I think you used an example where you're talking about like Mars and Venus, and you're using it to describe and like correlate through like the action of Vulcan and like the production of diamonds. Like, could you elaborate on that one a little bit more? Because that was really cool, I thought.
Absolutely. That's one of the so part of the way I break down um, the stories, and when I look at them, is I'm applying these stories to the world, and I'm taking the mechanics and looking at what's happening in the story, and then taking and applying that to our real world and looking for these same procedures and these same types of things. So one of the ways and inspirations for that for me was the story of the net. And this one's an easy one for people to look up. The story of the net was from Roman or Greek mythology. And in this story, there's an entire little, and there's famous paintings about it and whatnot. Vulcan, who's married to Venus, he comes home and finds his wife having an affair with Mars. And so he takes and has it out with Mars, and then binds them into the corner of the room, up into the corner, and with this net, this special net that keeps them bound and locked together. So when you start reading the story and breaking it down, and you start applying things like the fact that Vulcan is volcano fire. This is white fire, the fourth level of fire as far as an alchemist is concerned. This is insanely hot. This will melt stone. Now, this is opposed to a light heat, which when you're dealing with, like, say, an oil, with oils, they, once you burn them and scorch them as a cook, we all understand that when you scorch an oil, there's no one scorching it. So you're wanting to work with these light level heats. So understanding these things as an alchemist is key. And with Vulcan, this is super hot fire. Now, when he has it out with Mars, what's going to happen is then Mars you need to apply to iron as an alchemist, because Mars and iron are the same thing. When Vulcan or this white fire hits this iron, what's going to happen is it's going to drop out this carbon molecule, and it's going to become more unstable. And so now this copper is going to be able to bind with it and create an alloy, as opposed to these two things just mixing together. Like, people can watch and see real neat videos of people making Damascus steel, where they've just got a mixture of copper in there, and it's layered, and it expresses itself in little ribbons of copper inside of the iron. Really neat to look at. But this is different. This is an alloy. Now, because this has become an unstable metal, these two metals now bind together, and now they can't be broken apart the same way. They aren't just a mixture. They're bound. They're a new thing. And so this thing now is called the net, and it'll cool off. And as it cools, it will turn purple, and it'll create all these little geometric diamonds, and they will start expressing themselves just naturally. Super neat. And so when you understand that, and then you start looking at all the other stories and myths and applying them to the world, you find out that they did through these amazing stories preserved the way nature works for the questioning mind in the future that was going to find it, was going to want to search for these things, because the information has been passed through interesting stories, like that story of heathen creation. That story is an amazing, colorful, wonderful story that's lasted thousands of years, lasted through the Dark Ages, through the Christianization, through so much, because it's an amazing, interesting story. The understandings didn't pass with it, but the story did, which is part of why Odin fears losing. He sends his two ravens out and he fears losing one, but he fears losing the other a little bit more. If you lose the story, now we got nothing. If you just lose the understanding, some mind is going to come back later and hear that story and go, you know what? That's interesting. And once you start doing that, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just so fascinating. It's just amazing how we can look at ancient mythology and kind of utilize like archetypal natures of things and then carry them over into like across various realms, in particular chemistry. And like,
Yes.
something I was thinking about, like in regards to like planetary correspondences and like the validity of their virtue, and like within the archetypal realm and their correspondences, is kind of like, I was thinking about I think it was like if you grind up, I don't know if this is exactly precise, but for example, if you blend up some tinfoil powder and then you combine it with some magnetite, like iron filings, to create essentially thermite. And I'm thinking about it like, okay, you're working with that expansive jovial energy of Jupiter or Thor, the god of thunder, and then that Martian iron filing, that hot fiery nature of Ares. And then if you're looking at Greek mythology and like the combination of the two and the reaction that they can have together, that expansive effect of fire and thunder.
What's really fucking interesting about thermite is, so thermite isn't an actual just thing. There's actually a number of things that'll do thermite, but that thermite reaction, it's just really cool, because rather than like where we were talking about before, where oxygen is taking apart this particle and jumping over and doing that, it's like this oxygen is getting ripped and forced into this other particle, and it's an oxygen jump from one to the other rather than the oxygen ripping away and doing what it's supposed to do. And when it does that, it's such a nasty, harsh, violent thing that it creates this just insane exothermic reaction from that jump, and just crazy. And so then that's what you call then a thermite reaction. Super interesting. That's an interesting thought, especially, tin's going to be then Thor. Let's see here. So iron, then when you think about it, then an interesting thing then too is part of why, that's super interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't put thermite to the gods yet, but iron's got a super interesting reaction to mercury, because part of the reason that this reaction happens that's really weird like that is because iron's kind of weird. Iron is one of the few things that mercury won't just amalgamate immediately. Like you put gold into mercury, it just like, it's gone. It just eats it. Silver, but iron, you can take iron and you can float that right in mercury, and the mercury's not really going to react to the iron. And so, right. So it's a non-mercurial reaction. And I actually had already suspected that there was a thermite reaction actually going on, because the heat, the exothermic reaction of the thun, my name is Thor. The exothermic reaction that's happening isn't really the radiation that's happening. There's multiple different energies coming off of the sun.
Well,
And the
that's
heat, the exotherm. Go ahead.
oh no, it's just I mean that's just fascinating thinking about it. Like I haven't put those dots together. I wanted to ask you something, but
Second, I got to write that down. We're
okay.
actually functionally working
Nice.
pieces
We're
of this
discovering
out.
new things as we
As-
speak.
Yeah, I've got to write this down. I'm sorry. So that way I can look at that again later. And that's the
sure.
thing is Lucas and I want as many perspectives as we can get, because we're trying to figure out the world, and most of these things have been hidden and obfuscated
hmm
and confused, and we've lost the understanding. That understanding's gone, and
sure.
we're actively trying to pull it out. And the world is pretty it's simple and insanely complicated at the same time, and extraordinarily beautiful. So we're actively working out the different pieces. One of the ones that just a couple weeks ago I was on Interverse with Chance Carton,
hmm
and we were talking about the cosmic egg, and it struck me that I was never a mud flood person at all. And then it struck me that during the electrolysis process, this magic sludge happens to appear in this machine, and it happens every time, and there's no real explanation for it.
Brown's
I
gas
have a
machine.
pretty good theory. Yeah. And I have some pretty good theories, but while the world's a galvanic cell, it's only half the time a galvanic cell. The other half of the time, it's going to be going through electrolysis, because that battery is going to wear itself out like any other battery. And so the other half of the time, it's going through electrolysis. And when that hard spike in the electrolysis process starts, we're going to have this same sludge is just going to appear in the electrolytic fluid, which is where we live. And that happens inside this Brown's gas machine all the time. So that's like, wow, okay, I do have an actual scientific example of this happening inside of a setup like this.
Fascinating.
So we're actively working on understanding all these different little idiosyncrasies, all these different little weird things and whatnot, and trying to put it all together in one nice, fully functional understanding that we can then hopefully replicate and put on a desk.
You guys are doing a good job so far, because I don't know, I've gained a lot of insight from your overall perspective on things personally, and it kind of just illuminated a lot of areas that I hadn't yet really thought about. So I commend you on that. And I just
Greatly
have a few.
Appreciated.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely true. I have a few more questions before we kind of wrap it up that I wanted to get to. And I don't know, like,
No problem.
if this is even something that you're familiar with or can respond to, but I'm curious, like, so like if you take
I'm
like
dying curious what you got in your jars back here. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm
you
dying
are?
curious
Okay.
what you got in your jars.
So
back
let's
here.
see
Yeah.
which jars do I have back here?
It's been eating at me, and I just can't take it.
Which
no
one
more.
are you
It's eating
seeing?
at me now.
These ones down here?
Up above your right hand shoulder, next to your looks like you got a little alembic setup going on. Yeah, up here. What you got going on up here?
So this is cool. I'll show you something cool.
Look at, as you move your camera around, you got jars everywhere. It's fantastic.
So my uncle made this thing.
Nice.
Nice. Pretty cool. I got a couple of things like that, but I have the pretentious distillation apparatus behind me, but I do not use it enough that I should. I've used it. I was just in the process of relocating, so I kind of reset everything up here. But I'm hoping to get to some distillations soon. I'm itching for some, you know?
Absolutely, I do.
A bunch of different herbs I've harvested out of a canyon. Got a bunch of
all wild harvested.
Yeah,
that's
for sure.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Got some mullein, some wild Arizona native mint.
Good one.
I got oregano, datura, goldenrod.
Oregano's so good.
Mormon tea, all that good stuff. So I don't know. I got a bunch of random shit.
Good stuff. Well, you got a good collection there. That's some nice stuff. Love it.
Yeah,
Love it.
appreciate it.
Love seeing that. Sorry
All right.
about that though. Go ahead
No
with your
worries.
questions.
All right, so so metallic, I'm going to use the example of metallic silver. I think, and I don't know if this is exactly precise, but I think it can be put into like nitric acid, and then I guess it could be pushed over to like silver nitrate, and then it could be moved from there to silver sulfate, and then silver acetate, something along those lines. So I'm thinking, like nitrate, sulfate, acetate. These are all what I've looked up. They're called, I guess, they're atomic, ions, of which are they're polyatomic ions, which there are about 10. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight into like kind of the dynamics of polyatomic ionic states and how they tie into metallic processes within alchemy in any other ways, like, or maybe, I just feel like there's something to be explored with all of that. Like, say, not silver, but if your starting material was lead.
Oh no,
example,
any metal, it's gonna work like this. So when you're getting down to the purities of it, and this is one of the beautiful things that you're starting to see when you really understand a battery and understand these transmutations that can happen, is that the way these particles express themselves, they're expressing themselves by the number of ions and the number of electrons and the way these things are bound together. So as you start losing these pieces of ions, and then the expression of it changes. So now this isn't quite the same thing that it was before, and the entire expression of it changes. And you can break that down and keep dropping off pieces of it and pieces of it. And what you're really getting to is a more refined state, a more and more refined state. You're now not only just getting down to the purity of just the silver in and of itself, you're actually breaking apart the basic particles in and of themselves and getting down to a more pure essence. And so this has an extreme use then, because then again, when you're talking about, then that took all kinds of energy, or that actually expresses all kinds of energy typically when things are breaking down. And then now we also understand that these same ions and these same electrons that were released while this thing was degrading and changing into other states, because that's all it means when it's saying it's degrading, is it's changing into another state. It's losing some of that ion, is it's degrading. And so once you've gotten down to this fineness, now when we go and put it back together on the other side, we start understanding that we can put that back together, and it doesn't necessarily have to go back together as silver. It could be like, but when we get it down to a fine enough state, when we get it down to just the raw ions, that ion can be any damn thing. The electron can be any damn thing. And what I think is, and this is where I think the sludge is coming from, is I think when the electron is passing through those plates, because you send the electron through the plates, and then it ends up meeting the ion, because then through, like we were just talking about earlier, with the resistance, where some of that electron gets released in heat and in radiation, well, that's going to get released out into the mercurial or electrolytic fluid, where all these fucking ions are floating around, and they're all sitting in this mercurial fluid together, just waiting to get bound back together. And so, like I said, that ion could have really been anything, because it can go over, and when it's that fine, it goes over into that gold side and goes back together, and all these things start reducing and coming back together. Because when it's breaking apart, it's an expansion. There's an expansion happening. When it's coming back together like that, it's a reduction. So now it's coming back into one solid piece again and becoming one thing. And when it gets reduced, all these things become gold again. All these different metals, they all start as gold and all will end up as being gold. And so understanding that these states can transfer like this, and then understanding that the ions in and of themselves really aren't as coded as what a person would think. Like I said, I think they can be rewritten, and I think that's what's going on, is that electron is catching that coding from passing through those plates, and it's like, I'm one of you now. And so when it grabs ions, it grabs it to match, and all of a sudden, bing, a little particle of whatever that metal was appears in the water. Now, I'm gonna have to conduct some experiments to even come close to trying to prove that in a actual scientific manner, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. Unlike the science that we see today of everywhere, my science, I actually want to prove things and have them happen in the lab and be able to replicate it and be able to say, hey, this is how it works, and have you go be able to do it in your little lab, and we can all start benefiting.
Amen to that. Yeah, for sure. I want to ask you one more question. I have a lot more questions for you, by the way, but maybe we could do a feature or podcast or something like that. But
if you want to keep going, we can keep going. If you want to do one again later, I'm absolutely enjoying it, brother. I love seeing what you're doing. We can absolutely talk again.
All right. Well, in regards to, and as we were just talking about experimentation, with alchemy in particular, like what aspects within alchemy really captivate you currently, or what are some of your current operations in terms of like lab work or any form of alchemical experimentation, maybe medicinally or technologically or whatever, that you would maybe kind of just, you really feel intrigued by currently?
So the thing I'm working on right now, the most, so your setup behind you there, what that's going to do is that's going to fraction everything off according to heat. And so depending on the stability of the oil that's in there, some oils are more unstable than others. Now, every plant has 3 levels of oil. Everything on every organic body has 3 levels of oil. The most volatile of those oils is your terpene level. And when you step outside and you have a nice little garden, be it flowers or plants or whatever, food, when the sun hits that in the morning, the scent is going to get much stronger and much greater. And that's because these terpene level oils are starting to burn off, and you're smelling that burnt off oil. And so that's what you're doing with that heat, is you're going to control the level of heat. Well, I mean, you can do 2 things. You can just distill out and strip the oil away through hot water, alcohol, whatever solvent it is that you're using. Or once you have that, you can then take and fractionally distill the oil according to that. And so your first oil that's going to burn off is going to be your terpene level oil. And then after that's all been taken off, you can slightly add more heat and take off the next level, and slightly add more heat and take off the next level. And then you can turn around and fraction apart each of those levels. On the other side, one thing most people don't realize is just like freezer burn or frostbite burns just like heat does, you can actually do all those things in an extremely cold environment also. So rather than doing my extractings through heat and my separations through heat, I have been working on getting my system colder and colder. I'm operating at -40 right now, where then I can take and strip these oils out at a negative temperature. And the saying, a woman scorned never returns. That's the oil side, the feminine side. And as soon as you scorch oil, it's gone. So the colder I can do that, the more lively and the more perfect that side stays. so I can then take and extract it in its perfection without losing or degrading any of those oils. So that's what I've been working on.
That's amazing that you're doing that, operating with the cold principle versus the hot principle. Sounds like a very Odinistic approach.
Oh, you bet.
That's fascinating.
You betcha.
Wow.
Odin's wise.
I'm really curious to see what you have coming forward with all that. That's really cool. Do you
Well, it's
have
fascinating too, because then after you extract the oil, after I extract it, I put it in a bath of actually negative 150. And now that we're down to the purity of the oil, yeah. The oil will literally within a couple hours express itself and separate, and you can see the different levels of the plant oil expressed while it's in this bath of negative 150. And then you can start separating and playing with them and getting them. Well, the very bottom level, the most stable, then if you turn around and you can take off some of them lower levels, the try and pull off the terpene level and then put it in a little bit of heat, like 65 degrees. And the solvent that's released out from the in between the molecules at that point will the molecules will start binding back together, because that solvent was in there making an amalgam. And now that that's gone, these two like particles go beep and start lining themselves back up. Well, because of that separation in the oil levels, all the particles around it are just like it. So it starts actually crystallizing. And so that very bottom layer then will crystallize, and I can pull the top layer off liquidy. That bottom layer will crystallize, and then I can get the middle layer out. So now we've got these really pure structured levels of oil, where the oil has now taken on a masculine structure, like the masculine side has, which is just freaking amazing, right?
Yeah, wow, that is so amazing. I just have that never looked at it from that angle or heard about anybody doing it from that angle. So that's super innovative, and yeah, I can't wait to see what comes of all this. I just want to give you a moment, if there's any last words or anything that you want to, any notes you want to end on, anything you want to say to the audience, this floor is yours. So go ahead and whatever message you want to put out there.
Absolutely. All I can say is we're coming into a time of the world where we understand that the systems are breaking down, and we're seeing that so much of it's been lies and so much of it's just been wrong. And all the things that we thought we could trust, we just can't. And that was always supposed to be the lesson. Don't give away your power. Don't give it up to authority. Other people are not smarter than you. You know best for you. Start trusting in yourself and observing for yourself. And as we move forward, the only way that we're going to be able to do that is through community and through people like each other, and starting to actually trade, starting to look at these wonderful things that can be turned into different medicines. And now we can trade that with each other. And really where the government steps in is when you try and make a big profit, when you start trying to make money. They want they want their shekels. And if you're going to get some shekels, they want them too. They don't care about you trading things amongst each other and not having shekels. There's even camps where people set up where they just trade and barter and things like that. That's just fine. So it's only when you start trying to dip into their system that they want a piece. And their system is falling apart. If you want a new system, you need to start doing these things and start taking an active hand. Start taking an active hand in science. Mainstream science has a thing called the replication crisis. And I want everybody to look that up. That the majority of science since the 1970s cannot be reproduced. Over 80%. It was never science if you can't reproduce it. And look at how simple when I break things down, and I understand it's a little complicated the first time you hear it, and you can look at some other interviews and go back through it and go watch videos, and it starts getting real simple. It's not something that you need somebody with a white coat and 300 degrees to try and break down for your dumb minds. That's not the way the world is. You can understand it. You can make it. That's what we're here for. That's what we're here to do.
Yes, I mean, 100%. The message of individual sovereignty, like if we want to remain free individuals, we have to start to unchain ourselves from the weight of any systems or ideologies that are essentially acting as parasitic in the sense that they're surviving and being perpetuated by basically latching onto us. Yeah.
This is hilarious because his name is Sky.
No
I
way.
want you to know his name is Sky.
That's cool.
Yeah, swear to God.
That's badass.
It's SKIE, not Y. But this is my mom's dog, and she's going through. Stop biting. Nope, not the both. But yeah, his name's funny. Sky, so that's just hilarious. He'd come up and lick my face while you're. Yeah, that's hilarious.
That is awesome. Well, man, I really this was fun. I'd love to do another one at some point because I got a lot more questions we could go into. I appreciate you. Where do you want to direct people to like locate you and find out more about your work and everything that you're doing?
Well, I would definitely like to direct everybody to Rockfin. Some people don't understand that Rockfin is absolutely a free account to sign up. And unless the video says premium, which is something that the content maker chooses, you can watch any of the videos for free that don't say premium. And if you go in and make an account, just like YouTube, you can chat, all those things. The only time that you need to pay the $9.99, which if you want to support the show, Benjamin Balderson, Odins Alchemy, sign up under me. I always appreciate that. Absolutely. But again, you're going to be able to watch all these shows. Just come over to Rockfin where everything's completely uncensored. I do have an Odyssey now. Same name, Benjamin Balderson's Odins Alchemy. And I have a YouTube, which you're going to get little bitty clips of the show on, because as soon as we want to start talking like an adult, we have to switch over to platforms that don't think that they get to choose what I say and think. So if you want to do that, you need to start supporting those platforms. The whole reason that YouTube was free was so they could have this control. It's one of my favorite quotes out of the Greeks, and I'm not real fond of the Greeks, but one of my favorite quotes was Diogenes, where, the other philosopher came up and told him that he wouldn't have to live off bread and lentils if he would learn to be subservient to the king. And Diogenes looked at him and said, you wouldn't have to be subservient to the king if you could live to learn off of lentils and bread. So
that's awesome. Well, that's beautiful. Betcha. Yeah, Rockfin's awesome. They've yet to accept me into their community of creators. Hopefully, eventually that'll come. But I appreciate you. Appreciate your time. And yeah, just enjoy your night and have a good one. And until next time.
Absolutely.